By the 10th day, sniper Kate Wilson's mind was breaking. She was seeing hallucinations confusing reality with fantasy, but her finger remained on the trigger, and she had to keep waiting. The mission had started simple enough. Intelligence indicated that General Kozlov, the enemy's supreme commander, would be visiting the compound sometime within a 10-day window. Kate's job was to take the shot that would end the war. Which city in the world are you watching this video from today? Please subscribe and support us for more stories. But nobody had told her she would have to wait 10 days without moving. Kate Wilson was the Army's most accomplished sniper. Over 6 years of service, she had completed 127 confirmed kills and earned recognition as the most patient marksman in military history. Her record for holding position was 72 hours during a siege in Afghanistan, a feat that had already pushed the boundaries of human endurance. This mission would test limits that no human had ever been asked to endure. Kate's journey to this impossible assignment had begun 8 years earlier when she enlisted as an 18-year-old from rural Montana. Growing up on a ranch, she had learned to shoot before she could properly ride a bike, spending countless hours hunting in the vast wilderness that surrounded her family's property. Her father, a Vietnam veteran, had recognized her exceptional marksmanship abilities early and encouraged her development through competitive shooting programs. By age 16, Kate was winning state championships and setting records that attracted military recruiters from across the country. Basic training at Fort Benning had been a revelation for Kate. While other recruits struggled with weapons qualification, she consistently scored perfect marks and quickly caught the attention of Special Operations Command. Her psychological evaluations showed unusual mental toughness and an almost supernatural ability to remain calm under pressure. Sniper school at Fort Moore had been the most challenging experience of Kate's young life. The program's 98% failure rate eliminated candidates who couldn't handle the extreme physical and mental demands of precision shooting under combat conditions. Kate not only graduated, but finished first in her class with scores that instructors called the highest they had ever recorded. Her first deployment to Afghanistan had established Kate's reputation as an exceptional combat sniper. Operating in the mountainous regions near the Pakistani border, she had successfully eliminated high-value targets at ranges that other snipers considered impossible. Her patience and precision had saved countless American lives by removing enemy commanders who were coordinating attacks against coalition forces. The second deployment to Iraq had tested Kate's skills in urban warfare environments where civilian casualties had to be avoided at all costs. Her ability to distinguish between combatants and non-combatants in complex scenarios had earned her commendations from commanders who valued both her lethal effectiveness and her moral judgment. Kate's third deployment had been to Syria, where she had operated behind enemy lines for months at a time, gathering intelligence and eliminating key terrorist leaders. It was during this assignment that she had first demonstrated her extraordinary ability to remain motionless for extended periods while waiting for targets to appear. The current mission represented the culmination of Kate's career and the ultimate test of her capabilities. General Kozlov was the architect of a 3-year war that had cost thousands of lives and destabilized an entire region. Intelligence agencies had been hunting him for months, but he had remained elusive, moving between safe houses and rarely appearing in locations where conventional military action could reach him. The sniper position Kate had selected was perfect from a tactical standpoint. Located on a ridgeline 800 meters from the target compound, it provided excellent concealment among natural rock formations while offering a clear line of sight to the main building where Kozlov would conduct his inspection. The hide itself was a masterpiece of camouflage and preparation. Kate had spent 3 days constructing a position that would be invisible to enemy surveillance, while providing the stability necessary for precision shooting. Every detail had been considered, from the angle of her rifle rest to the positioning of her water supply and emergency equipment. The problem was timing. Intelligence reports indicated that Kozlov would visit the compound during a 10-day period, but they couldn't narrow the window beyond that range. Satellite imagery and intercepted communications suggested the visit was imminent, but operational security meant that even Kozlov's own staff wouldn't know the exact timing until hours before his arrival. This uncertainty created an impossible tactical situation. Kate had to be in position and ready to take the shot at any moment during the 10-day window. But the compound was under constant surveillance by multiple security teams, roving patrols, and observation posts equipped with advanced detection equipment. Any movement in the sniper hide would be spotted immediately. If Kate was discovered, not only would the mission fail catastrophically, but her position would be compromised and she would almost certainly be killed or captured. The enemy's standing orders for dealing with snipers were to eliminate them immediately and publicly as a deterrent to others. So Kate had to remain perfectly still for 10 days, without sleeping, without eating substantial food, without moving a single muscle that might create a detectable signature. The physiological challenges were staggering beyond normal human experience. The human body wasn't designed to remain motionless for extended periods. Blood circulation would slow dramatically, increasing the risk of dangerous clots. Muscles would cramp and eventually begin to atrophy. Joints would stiffen to the point where movement became painful and difficult. Dehydration would begin affecting cognitive function within 48 hours. Starvation would start breaking down muscle tissue for energy within 72 hours. Sleep deprivation would cause hallucinations and impaired judgment that could prove fatal in a combat environment. But the psychological challenges would be far worse than the physical ones. Day 1 had been manageable, almost routine. Kate settled into her position 3 hours before dawn, carefully arranging her equipment and settling her rifle into the precise firing position she had calculated during her reconnaissance. Her breathing was controlled, her heart rate was steady, and her mind was focused on the mission ahead. The morning passed slowly as Kate observed the compound through her scope, learning the routines of the guards and identifying the patterns of patrol movement that would help her predict when Kozlov might appear. She took mental notes of vehicle arrivals, personnel changes, and any indicators that might suggest increased security activity. By afternoon, Kate had mapped every visible aspect of the compound's operations. She knew which guards smoked cigarettes at regular intervals, which vehicles belonged to permanent staff versus visitors, and where the primary observation posts were located. This intelligence gathering was automatic for her, a product of years of training and operational experience. Evening brought the first challenge of maintaining position as temperatures dropped and wind patterns changed. Kate's body wanted to shiver in response to the cold, but any involuntary movement could potentially expose her location. She used breathing techniques and mental focus exercises to maintain body temperature while remaining perfectly still. Night fell with no sign of Kozlov's arrival. Kate continued her vigil in complete darkness, using her night vision scope to monitor the compound while listening for any sounds that might indicate increased activity. The first 24 hours had passed without incident, but Kate knew this was just the beginning. Day 2 brought the first serious physical discomfort. Muscle cramps began in Kate's legs and lower back as her body protested the unnatural stillness. The pain was sharp and insistent, demanding movement that she couldn't allow. Kate used meditation techniques learned during survival training to manage the discomfort while maintaining her ready position. The psychological aspect of Day 2 was the growing awareness of time passing slowly. Hours felt like days as Kate's mind had nothing to focus on except the compound and her own increasing discomfort. She began running through mental exercises, reciting military protocols, and reviewing technical specifications to keep her mind occupied. Food became a critical issue on Day 2. Kate had brought high-energy nutrition bars that she could consume without significant movement, but eating even these required careful timing to avoid detection. She limited herself to tiny portions taken only when patrol schedules created brief windows of reduced observation. Water consumption had to be balanced against the physiological need to urinate, which would require movement that could expose her position. Kate had prepared for this challenge with specialized equipment, but the process was uncomfortable and created additional stress about maintaining concealment. Day 3 introduced the first significant dehydration effects. Kate's mouth became increasingly dry, her concentration began to waver slightly, and she started experiencing the mild headaches that preceded more serious dehydration symptoms. But she couldn't increase her water intake without creating other problems. The compound's activity patterns had become familiar by day 3, and Kate began to worry that the routine nature of operations might indicate that Kozlov's visit had been postponed or canceled. But intelligence updates received through her encrypted communication system confirmed that the visit was still planned within the original time frame. Day 3 also brought the first instances of microsleep, brief periods where Kate's brain shut down for seconds at a time without her conscious awareness. These episodes were dangerous because they could occur at the moment when Kozlov appeared, causing her to miss the critical shot opportunity. Kate began using painful pressure points and controlled breathing exercises to maintain alertness, but she knew that these techniques would become less effective as sleep deprivation accumulated over the following days. Day 4 was when hunger began seriously affecting Kate's thinking processes. Her stomach cramped with emptiness despite the small amounts of food she had been able to consume. Her blood sugar levels had dropped to ranges that made fine motor control more difficult, and her hands began experiencing slight tremors that required conscious effort to control. The hunger was accompanied by a psychological effect that Kate hadn't anticipated. Her mind began fixating on food, creating detailed fantasies about meals she had enjoyed in the past, and elaborate plans for what she would eat when the mission was completed. These food-focused thoughts were distracting and had to be consciously suppressed to maintain mission focus. Day 4 also brought the first signs that her body was beginning to consume muscle tissue for energy. Kate could feel weakness in her arms and shoulders that made holding her rifle position more difficult. The degradation was subtle but noticeable to someone with her level of body awareness. Communication with her support team became more important on day 4, as Kate needed confirmation that the mission was still active and that Kozlov's visit hadn't been canceled. The brief radio contacts provided psychological comfort but also created operational risk, as any electromagnetic emissions could potentially be detected by enemy counter-surveillance equipment. Day 5 brought the first true hallucinations. Kate began seeing movement that wasn't there. Shadows that seemed to shift and dance in her peripheral vision despite her logical knowledge that the rocks around her position were stationary. Sounds became distorted, and she found herself hearing conversations and vehicle noises that weren't actually occurring. The hallucinations were mild at first, easily dismissed as products of fatigue and stress, but Kate recognized them as the beginning of a psychological deterioration that would only get worse over the remaining days of the mission. She began implementing mental exercises designed to help her distinguish between real and imaginary stimuli. The most dangerous aspect of the Day 5 hallucinations was that they made Kate want to investigate and verify what she was experiencing. Every instinct screamed at her to turn her head, to move her rifle, to check for threats that her brain was convinced were present. But any movement could compromise the mission and potentially get her killed. Kate had to learn to ignore her own senses and trust only in the discipline of maintaining her position regardless of what her deteriorating mind was telling her. Day 6 was when Kate realized that her mind was actively working against her mission's success. The hallucinations became more vivid and persistent, taking on characteristics that seemed completely real despite their impossibility. She saw enemy soldiers approaching her position from angles that would have been visible in her peripheral vision. She heard her name being called by voices that sounded like her fellow soldiers. She felt insects crawling on her skin in places where no insects could possibly be present. But the most insidious aspect of Day 6 was that the hallucinations began to include scenarios where the mission had been canceled or where she had received orders to abandon her position. Kate's mind was creating elaborate false realities where she was free to move, to eat, to drink, to relieve the growing physical and psychological pressure. These false relief scenarios were more dangerous than the threatening hallucinations because they offered her brain an escape from the impossible situation she was actually in. Kate had to constantly remind herself that any communication about mission cancellation would come through her encrypted radio system, not through the voices and visions her mind was creating. The psychological warfare was now internal. Kate was fighting not just against external enemies, but against her own brain's desperate attempts to escape an impossible situation. Day 7 introduced paranoid delusions that created an entirely new level of psychological challenge. Kate became convinced that the enemy knew her exact location and was deliberately waiting for her to break position before moving against her. She imagined elaborate psychological operations designed specifically to drive her insane, with enemy specialists monitoring her mental state and adjusting their tactics to maximize her psychological pressure. Every sound from the compound became part of this imagined psychological warfare campaign. Guard rotations were timed to create maximum stress. Vehicle movements were designed to create false alerts. Even the natural sounds of wind and wildlife were interpreted as deliberate attempts to break her concentration. The paranoid thinking created a feedback loop where Kate's attempts to counter imaginary psychological operations actually increased her stress and accelerated her mental deterioration. She found herself creating complex theories about enemy capabilities and intentions that had no basis in reality but felt completely logical from her perspective. But beneath the chaos of her deteriorating mental state, Kate's professional training continued to function at a subconscious level. Her rifle remained aimed at the target building. Her fingers stayed positioned on the trigger guard, and her body maintained the precise shooting stance that had been drilled into her through thousands of hours of practice. Day 8 brought complete sensory confusion that made distinguishing reality from hallucination almost impossible. The compound below seemed to shift and change like a living organism. Buildings appeared and disappeared, people materialized from nothing and vanished just as quickly, and the landscape itself seemed to breathe and pulse with unnatural life. Kate's visual system was providing information that her logical mind knew was impossible, but the images were so vivid that they felt completely real. Audio hallucinations became constant and varied. Kate heard explosions that left no visible damage, conversations in languages she didn't recognize, and mechanical sounds from vehicles that weren't present. The auditory chaos made it difficult to detect real sounds that might indicate actual activity in the compound. Her sense of touch was equally compromised. Kate felt rain that wasn't falling, temperature changes that didn't correspond to actual weather conditions, and physical sensations that ranged from burning pain to complete numbness. Her body's sensory systems were malfunctioning in ways that made objective assessment of her physical condition nearly impossible. Day 8 was also when Kate's body began shutting down non-essential systems to preserve core functions. She had lost significant weight as her metabolism consumed muscle tissue for energy. Her reflexes had slowed noticeably, and her fine motor control was degraded to the point where normal activities would have been difficult. But somehow, impossibly, she maintained her shooting position. The muscle memory and trained responses that had been developed through years of practice operated below the level of conscious thought, keeping her ready to engage, despite her body's overall deterioration. Day 9 was when Kate began having extended conversations with people who weren't there. The hallucinated conversations felt completely natural and realistic. Kate spoke with her dead grandmother, who had raised her during her early childhood. She argued with her drill instructor from basic training about proper shooting techniques. She had lengthy discussions with enemy soldiers who appeared in her position and seemed genuinely interested in her well-being. These conversations provided psychological relief from the isolation and stress of the mission, but they also represented a dangerous disconnect from reality. Kate found herself looking forward to visits from her hallucinated companions and feeling genuine sadness when they departed. The most dangerous conversations were with people who tried to convince her to abandon the mission. Her imaginary grandmother urged her to come home and stop risking her life. Her phantom drill instructor told her that she had already proven herself and didn't need to continue suffering. Enemy soldiers offered her food, water, and medical care if she would surrender her position. Kate had to fight not just physical collapse and psychological disintegration, but active manipulation from her own subconscious mind that was desperately seeking escape from an intolerable situation. Day 9 also brought periods where Kate completely forgot her own identity and the nature of her mission. She would spend hours unable to remember her name, her military service, or why she was holding a rifle in a rocky hide position. Reality had become so fragmented that she existed in a dreamlike state where nothing made complete sense. But even during these episodes of complete dissociation, some deeper part of her mind maintained the shooting position and continued to monitor the compound. Her training had become so deeply ingrained that it operated independently of her conscious awareness. Day 10 began with Kate no longer having any reliable connection to consensus reality. Her hallucinations had become so elaborate and consistent that they formed their own internal reality that was more vivid and compelling than the actual world around her. She was living in a fantasy landscape populated by people from her past, imaginary enemies, and symbolic figures that represented her fears and desires. In this alternate reality, Kate was simultaneously a child playing in her grandmother's garden, a soldier fighting in multiple historical wars, and a prisoner being tortured in elaborate scenarios that changed constantly. Time had no meaning, and cause and effect relationships followed dream logic rather than physical laws. The compound that she was supposed to be watching had become just one element in a constantly shifting dreamscape. Sometimes it was her childhood home, sometimes it was a prison where she was being held, and sometimes it was a school where she was taking an exam that she hadn't prepared for. Kate's conscious mind was no longer capable of distinguishing between these fantasy scenarios and the actual tactical situation. But muscle memory and years of training continued to operate below the level of awareness, maintaining her position and keeping her rifle aimed at the target building. And then, 37 hours into the vigil, General Kozlov appeared. Kate's conscious mind was deep in a hallucination about her 8th birthday party when some deeper part of her brain recognized the target. Her training took over while her conscious mind was completely elsewhere, focused on blowing out imaginary candles on a cake that existed only in her memory. The recognition occurred at a level below conscious thought. Years of studying photographs and video footage of Kozlov had created neural patterns that could identify him even when Kate's conscious mind was incapable of rational thought. The target acquisition was automatic, like a reflex. Kate's body began the shooting sequence without any conscious decision to do so. Her breathing pattern shifted to the precise rhythm she had practiced thousands of times. Her heart rate slowed as her cardiovascular system responded to training cues that operated independently of mental state. The shot was perfect. Kate squeezed the trigger with mechanical precision, her body executing movements that had been drilled into her through years of repetitive practice. The bullet traveled 800 meters in 1.2 seconds and struck Kozlov's center mass with accuracy that would have been impressive under ideal conditions, let alone after 10 days of physical and psychological torture. The general dropped immediately, his body armor unable to stop the .50 caliber round that had been fired with surgical precision. The war's most wanted target was eliminated by a sniper who was barely conscious of taking the shot. Kate's conscious mind didn't register what had happened. In her hallucinatory state, she thought she had blown out the candles on her birthday cake, but her training continued to operate automatically, keeping her in position and maintaining security even after the shot had been fired. She held position for another 3 hours until extraction teams could reach her, following protocols that had been ingrained so deeply that they functioned even when her conscious mind was completely disconnected from reality. When the extraction team found Kate, she was catatonic, staring at the target area with unfocused eyes and mumbling incoherently about birthday parties and childhood memories. She showed no recognition of the soldiers who had come to rescue her and no awareness that her mission had been successful. The medical evacuation required immediate sedation and emergency psychological intervention. Kate had pushed human endurance beyond any documented limits and had somehow survived, but the cost to her mental health was severe and potentially permanent. Recovery took 14 months of intensive therapy and medical treatment. Kate had to relearn basic functions that her body had forgotten during the 10-day vigil. Physical therapy restored muscle function that had atrophied during her motionless weight. Nutritional support rebuilt her depleted body mass and restored metabolic function. Psychological counseling was more complex and took longer. Kate had to distinguish between memories of real events and the elaborate hallucinations that had dominated her final days in position. The boundary between reality and fantasy had been so thoroughly destroyed that rebuilding it required careful therapeutic work over many months. The shot that ended the war had been taken by a sniper who was clinically insane at the moment of firing. Kate's mind had completely broken down, but her training had held firm long enough to complete the most important mission of her career. The 240-hour sniper vigil became a classified case study in human endurance and psychological resilience. Military psychologists spent years analyzing Kate's experience to understand how training could override conscious thought when complete mental breakdown occurred. Kate's achievement established new understanding of human limits under extreme conditions and demonstrated that proper training could enable mission completion even when conscious control was lost to psychological trauma. Her experience became the foundation for new training programs designed to prepare soldiers for extended operations under impossible conditions. The compound where Kate had held position for 10 days was later converted into a memorial for soldiers who had made extreme sacrifices for mission success. Kate's eyes position was preserved exactly as she had left it, serving as a reminder of the lengths to which warriors would go to protect others. Years later, Kate returned to limited active duty with strict restrictions on extended operations. Her experience had provided invaluable data on human endurance, but it had also demonstrated the permanent psychological cost of pushing beyond normal human limits. The war that ended with Kate's shot had claimed thousands of lives over 3 years of fighting. Her 10 days of motionless waiting had prevented additional years of conflict and saved countless lives that would have been lost in continued fighting. General Kozlov's death had created a power vacuum that led to immediate ceasefire negotiations and eventually to lasting peace agreements. Kate's ultimate endurance test had quite literally ended the war with a single shot fired by someone who was no longer entirely present in reality. The 20-40 hours that Kate Wilson spent in perfect stillness represented the longest confirmed sniper vigil in military history. Her achievement demonstrated that human determination could overcome even the complete breakdown of mental function when lives depended on mission completion. The hallucinations that had tormented Kate during her final days in position became part of military legend. She had fought battles against enemies that existed only in her mind, while maintaining the focus necessary to engage a real target at the exact moment when it mattered most. Kate's finger had remained on the trigger through 10 days of psychological torture, physical agony, and complete mental collapse. When the critical moment arrived, her training had guided her hand, even when her mind was lost in childhood fantasies. The shot heard around the world had been fired by a sniper who was no longer entirely present in reality, but whose body had been so thoroughly trained that it could complete the mission even when consciousness had failed. Sometimes the most important victories require sacrificing part of yourself to achieve them. Kate had given her sanity to buy peace for an entire region, and her 240-hour vigil had proven that human determination and proper training could overcome any obstacle when failure meant the continuation of suffering and death. Her story became a testament to the power of military training to transcend normal human limitations and achieve the impossible when the stakes demanded nothing less than perfection under conditions that would break most people long before they could succeed.